for this biography. Dick Cheney, whom I interviewed a number of times, set up an interview for me with the former president. But just before I went out to Dallas, I received a telephone call from one of his aides who said, "The president does not wish to see you." He said, "You wrote a book critical of his father, and for that reason, he does not wish to see you," which was true. In 1992, I wrote a book called George Bush's War, which was highly critical of George Herbert Walker Bush's decision to attack Iraq. Now, before I begin talking about Bush and the biography, let me say a couple of words to put the biography in context. First, when it came to national security policy, George W. Bush was absolutely in charge, and the decisions were all his. He was indeed the decider. After 9/11, he established his role as commander-in-chief, and everything became chain of command. Bush was not the tool of Cheney or Condoleezza Rice or the neocons or anyone else. He was the driving force. Whether it was CIA renditions or NSA snooping or the war in Iraq, these were all personal decisions taken by the president, and everyone in the administration fell into line. In that context of how he did that, let me say a word about the National Security Council. The National Security Council was established after World War II by the Republican 80th Congress. And the purpose was to prevent the concentration of power in the White House that had happened under Roosevelt during World War II. It was modeled after the British War Cabinet, and it was intended to bring the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the head of the CIA, into conference with the President on national security issues. That was the National Security Council. Truman used it that way. Eisenhower used it that way. Eisenhower met every Thursday at 10 o'clock with the National Security Council, and during his 8 years in office, he presided over 314 meetings of the National Security Council. The change came under John Kennedy. Kennedy saw the National Security Council as a vehicle to enhance White House control, exactly the opposite of its original purpose. McGeorge Bundy was appointed Kennedy's National Security Advisor. Neither Truman nor Eisenhower had one, and the size of the staff mushroomed. Under Truman and Ike, the National Security Council staff consisted of 3 or 4 people, and these people were note takers and minute keepers. Under JFK, the size of the staff increased to 20 and began to handle policy issues. It doubled when Nixon became National Security Advisor under Nixon, and by the time George W. Bush became president, it numbered well over 100. These were professional experts in particular areas. In many respects, the National Security Council Act of 1947 had been turned on its head. Instead of a body that coordinated government policy as was intended, the National Security Council staff became a policy-making tool of the president, which ran policy from the White House, and the National Security Council staff enabled him to do so. The second point I would like to make initially is that George W. Bush was a born-again Christian and saw the world in biblical terms. This was especially true after 9/11. Bush defined the battle against terrorism as a struggle between good and evil, and saw himself as God's agent put here on earth to defeat the forces of Satan. Before the Iraq War, as he was trying to build up the coalition to go in, Bush called President Chirac of France and told him that the war against Saddam was the final struggle for civilization before the end of times. That Gog and Magog were at work in the Middle East, and that this was the struggle depicted in the book of Revelation before the final judgment. Schrock didn't know what Bush was talking about, and when his aides deciphered it, with the help of a professor in Basel, he was all the more convinced that he didn't want any part of it. Let me suggest that Bush's religious fixation is the common denominator behind the domestic excesses of his administration and the foreign policy blunders.